Hello again, students. Welcome to our next document discussion, the document discussion for Module 5, the Early Republic. And we have quite a lot of documents to read this week, or these couple of weeks. So get ready, buckle up. First three documents that we'll be talking about are Alaudo Equiano, Venture Smith, and Thomas Jefferson's Racism. So go ahead and get those documents ready. Either pull them up in a new tab or print them out, do some scribbling in the margins and some underlining. These are the first three documents that we'll be talking about because I encourage you to think about them as a unit. Think of them as a package. The question that we're going to be discussing here is that the second learning objective question about describing conditions of the early slave trade and how the nation understands race. So talking about the early slave trade, you got to talk about Alaudo Equiano. Alaudo Equiano in the middle passage. First of all, who is he? What is his message? What is his point? What's he talking about here? Right, gold star. Alaudo Equiano is a captive, and remember, he is a child when this happens. I don't actually know that it says in this document, but he's like 7 or 8. He's very young, and he is captured, kidnapped from the interior of Africa. He's taken to the coast, and then when this passage picks up is when he's actually on the middle passage, when he's on the middle section of that triangular trade from Africa to the Americas, to the New World. He's been sold into slavery. So remember, back from our textbook readings probably, we talked about the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the New World. If you look at that on a map, it looks like a triangle. The middle passage, that second leg of the journey from Africa to the Americas, is called the middle passage. It was the middle leg. It was the second leg of the journey. And that was where all of the Africans who were sold into slavery endured a lot of hardship, to put it mildly. They endured a lot of hardship. And Alaudo Equiano gives us a very graphic, very detailed account of what it was like on the middle passage. So what are some examples? What are some things that he talks about having to endure on that middle passage? One example, he talks about, just kind of walking through it almost line by line, he says the stench of the hold. Now remember, in our textbook, we've seen some pictures about how people are crammed in there like worse than sardines. The hold is the underbelly of the ships. There are very few doors, there are no windows, there's no light, there's no airflow. People are crammed in there so small. The slave ships had a rule. Believe it or not, these slave ships had rules. The slave ships, the industry of bringing people from one continent to the other as slaves, had a rule that each new slave in the hold was supposed to be given a rectangle of space on the floor, 1 foot across by 6 foot down. What is the potential problem with that? People's bodies are wider than 1 foot. That's not a lot of space, as is people's bodies are wider than 1 foot. That's the rule. That doesn't mean that slave ships followed that rule. They normally crammed more people in than even that allowed. So in the hold, there's no space. He says it's hot. The closeness of the place almost suffocated us. He says there's a smell because there's no sanitation, there's no airflow. He talks about how the stench and the conditions of the hold brought on a sickness among the slaves. Disease is running rampant. There's no place to go to the bathroom. Every 10 people, there's a bucket. But if you're chained together and you're the middle person, you're not going to be able to get to the bucket. Let your imagination run wild with that. Okay. If you're chained to a person who is dying of malaria or typhoid or what have you, chances are you're going to get it because you can't escape. So the conditions in the hold are inhumane. He talks about the shrieks of the women, the groans of the dying, a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Olaudah Equiano is pulling on all five of our senses. He talks about the smell. He talks about the feeling of people being crammed in really close to you. There's no light. The sounds, the shrieks and the groans. If you kind of let yourself, you can imagine almost what it might have been like to be in those conditions. Misery doesn't quite cut it. That's not an adequate word. A little bit later, towards the end of that first paragraph, he starts talking about hunger. My countrymen were pressed by hunger, and they took an opportunity to get a few fish. Some of the sailors were fishing over the side of the boat. Hooray for them. And some of the slaves tried to steal some of the fish. And what happens? They're flogged, they're whipped, they're beaten, just for trying to eat. One day when we had a smooth sea, he says, 2 of my wearied countrymen who were chained together, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made it through the nettings and jumped out of the sea. People are trying to commit suicide rather than have to endure this thing 1 minute longer. And what happens when those people try to commit suicide? One of them succeeds, so I guess congratulations. The other, however, is caught and flogged, whipped, beaten, punished extremely. So even if you, as a slave, try to escape in whatever measly way you can, whether that's death or something else, the risk is very high. The risk for failure is very, very high. So, Olaudah Equiano giving us a good example of what life was like on the Middle Passage for those early slaves right when they are captured. Our next document, Venture Smith, talking about what life was like for some of the slaves once they're here. Venture Smith is a lucky man in a lot of ways, because as we see in our very, very first paragraph, first couple of lines, he says, as I never had an opportunity of redeeming myself while I was owned by Minor, his former master, I was then very ambitious of obtaining it. I asked my current master, one time if he would consent to have me purchase my freedom. Okay, now what does this mean? What's happening here? Venture Smith is a slave, but he has asked for and has been given permission to try to pay for himself. He's buying himself. He's buying his freedom. So how does he... Now, we have to remember that not a lot of slaves, very few statistically, very few slaves have that opportunity, but Venture Smith does. And he says he's ambitious. He takes advantage of that opportunity. How does he pay for his freedom? Now remember, he's a slave. He's working constantly from daylight to dusk, all day, doing manual labor. And he's not paid for that labor. So how does he make money to pay for his freedom? He does extra work, right? This man, let's just think about this. Just sidebar, pause for a second. This man is working for somebody else from sun up to sundown, and he's not getting paid. He has 0 extra time, but somehow he takes some extra time. He finds a way to find more work for himself. And what kind of work is he doing? What are some examples? Right, more manual labor, right. He talks about fishing, he talks about farming, he hires himself out during the winter when things are a little bit slower, and he cuts wood, he says. Towards the end of the paragraph, or end of the first page, he's talking about cording wood, he's talking about threshing grain. So it's all very manual work, it's all very agricultural work, it's all work that takes a lot of time. And what kind of money, just in a general sense, what kind of money does he get paid for this work? Towards the end of the first page is where you can find that. He talks about 20 pounds, he talks about 13 pounds, and a few shillings. Statistically, if you do the math, that's not a lot. Less than minimum wage, right? If we flip back to the back page, the last few sentences, he says, the amount of money which I had paid my master towards redeeming my time he's buying himself, redeeming himself, was 71 pounds 2 shillings. And I was 36 years old. 36 years old. Most of his life is behind him. But he's finally, by golly, he's finally paid for his freedom. Venture Smith. Now, one more link that we might make between these two men. Olaudah Equiano and Venture Smith, right? They're both slaves, colonial, early republic era. But they both eventually do redeem their freedom in one way or another. And what is interesting, what is the first thing that they do when they earn their freedom? They write this stuff. They write this stuff. They become abolitionists. They tell their stories to anyone who will listen. They write down their stories. Either Olaudah Equiano is very educated and he himself writes it. Venture Smith dictates it to somebody else. But they publish books about their stories. They tell their stories to anyone who will listen, who will take the time to read, trying to convince people to abolish slavery as an institution. That's all they want. That's the first thing they do when they earn their freedom. And that's very important. So let's go to our third. It's very important because the odds are stacked against slaves earning their freedom, to put it mildly. So let's talk about our third document, Thomas Jefferson's racism. We talked a lot about Thomas Jefferson in the last primary document discussion. Normally, we think of Thomas Jefferson as this great guy, man. He's one of the founders of our country. He's one of the framers of the Constitution. He wrote / plagiarized the Declaration of Independence, which is one of the only times that you can just stand up and say, rah, 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 go America, unreservedly. We think of Thomas Jefferson as a paragon, as an ideal, as one of this great guy. And then we read this. It's not that great. He doesn't come out looking very well. Remember, Thomas Jefferson is a Virginian. He's a Southerner. He's a slave owner. And he's a man of his time, just like anybody else. He has ideas about race that, to today's 21st century minds, are kind of hard to stomach. So let's walk through this because, again, it's Thomas Jefferson and his language is very flowery. Let's try to figure out what it is he's talking about. Our very first few lines here, he says, he's always looking at Africans. The first difference which strikes us is that of color. Yes, Thomas Jefferson. Whether the black of the Negro resides in the reticular membrane between the skin and scarf skin or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of blood or the color of bile. All right, he's getting all scientific. What is it he's trying to do here? What is it he's trying to do? What is it he's trying to figure out? He's trying to figure out why black people are black. Why are black people, why do African Americans have black skin? He's trying to determine this very scientifically. He thinks of himself as a very, and he is, for his time, a very intellectual person. He thinks of himself as very intelligent. And he's trying to figure out why black people are black. A few sentences down, towards the middle of the page, he says, the circumstance of superior beauty is thought worthy attention to the propagation of our horses, dogs, and other domestic animals. Why not that of man? What's he talking about there? Remember, he's a Southerner. He's a slave owner. He owns a farm. He thinks of his slaves as another set of his domestic animals. And just as he would want to breed the best horses or the best hunting dogs, he also wants to breed the best slaves. This is not me talking, this is him, okay? He's trying to breed the best slaves. He wants to know why black people are black and what makes Africans so particularly well suited to manual labor so that he can have the best slaves and therefore, by extension, the best plantation. So right after that, again, still in the middle of the page there, he starts talking about differences between white people and African people. Those of color, figure, and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race. They have less skin on the hair, or less hair on their skin. They secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin. What does that mean? They sweat more, right? why? Okay. They sweat more, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. Well, yeah, sweaty people smell. Thomas Jefferson. Call the papers. This greater degree of transpiration renders them more tolerant of heat and less so of cold than the whites. Okay. Why is that important? Why is it important that Thomas Jefferson thinks that black people sweat more than white people? Right, because it makes them supposedly better suited towards working outside, daylight to dusk. Why would he want them? Okay, so we're kind of getting a sense here. Thomas Jefferson is trying to scientifically, genetically determine why African Americans are more suited to being slaves. If they sweat more than whites, then they're able to tolerate heat more than whites, and he can work them longer and harder than he can anybody else. Thomas Jefferson, everybody. It's not just genetic, he says. It's not just physical stuff that he's talking about. Towards the end of that first page, he starts talking about African American slaves' mental capacities, or supposed mental capacities. He says, in reason, much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid. Okay, for those of us who aren't math people, Euclid's the father of geometry. There's really complicated geometry, math stuff. Why can't slaves comprehend advanced geometry? Because they don't have educations. Because he doesn't let them have educations. It's not that they're inherently more stupid, Thomas Jefferson. It's that you don't let them be intelligent. Okay, if nobody's been taught geometry, you're not just going to instantly comprehend geometry. Thomas Jefferson, my friends, Thomas Jefferson's. Towards the end of that paragraph, he says, in music they are more generally gifted than the whites with accurate ears for tune and time, and they are found capable of imagining a small catch, a small tune. So it's not all bad, Thomas Jefferson admits. They have good taste in music. They have good rhythm, he says. The last paragraph. I advance it therefore as suspicion only, but he's pretty darn sure that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in endowments both of body and mind. Thomas Jefferson says that blacks are inferior to whites. He puts it out. Obviously, this is not true. We know this. 21st century brains are capable of comprehending this and understanding this. But he believes it's true. He believes it so firmly. He's given a lot of physical and cultural pieces of evidence to back up that claim. And this is important because in the early republic, Thomas Jefferson is a man of his time, right? A lot of people, basically everybody in the early Republican period believed that black people were inferior to white people. Black equaled inferior. That's the important thing to remember here. Black equaled inferior to them. Blacks equaled slaves. If somebody is inferior, they can be enslaved. This is how slavery was justified. Not only just justified, not only just begun, but this is how it is continued. A few lines down. The unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people, Thomas Jefferson says. What does that mean? The difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. African American people, Thomas Jefferson says, can't handle freedom. They can't handle liberty. They need someone to take care of them. So, if we're thinking about race and notions of race in the early Republican period, Thomas Jefferson gives us a lot of good/terrible examples that can help us think about that. So let's go to our last learning objective question, shifting gears here a little bit, talking about the shift in women's roles from that of coverture to Republican motherhood. So two separate ideals here. Our two documents that we're going to talk about here are the two Abigails, right? Abigail Bailey and Abigail Adams. Abigail Bailey is a good example of this idea of coverture. Now remember, coverture is this idea that women are not legal entities of their own. Women have to always be covered by a man in their life. When they're young, their father takes care of them. When they're an adult, their husband takes care of them. When they're old, their oldest son takes care of them. Women never have to take care of themselves. Women never get to take care of themselves. Abigail Bailey is a good example of that. She is in an abusive relationship, we find out. And what kind of abusive relationship? That first paragraph and the third paragraph is where we start to get a sense of that. She talks about Mr. Bailey's great wickedness, the human depravity. She talks about him being the author of our family miseries, whether it would be by the latter looked to me inexpressively painful. Okay, so we're getting a sense that it's really bad. Abigail Bailey, again, is a product of her time. You kind of have to read in between the lines here. What she's saying, what she's getting at, she keeps talking about her daughters. Mr. Bailey is raping his daughters and her, and she doesn't like it, so she wants to leave. Rightfully so, right? So she wants to leave. She confronts him, and what does she say? How does he react when she confronts him with this story of, oh, I've heard about this person doing these terrible, terrible things? Right. She lets him know that she's found out what he is doing to their daughters, and she doesn't like it, and that if he doesn't let her leave, she's going to do this tell-all, right? Do this tell-all book, call the papers, media. And so he lets her leave. Abigail Bailey is an example of coverture in that she has to go through this. It's very difficult for her to leave. It's not, on the other hand, it's not difficult for Mr. Bailey to get away with committing these crimes. He gets away with it. He's never punished. They almost never find out about it. Abigail Bailey is a pseudonym. It's not her real name. And so it's very easy for men to master their wives and their daughters in this manner. Again, it's that idea of coverture. Women aren't legal entities of their own. It's very difficult for Abigail Bailey to leave. If he had said, no one will ever believe you, you have to stay with me, there wasn't anything she could do. Divorce was very difficult for women to earn or to get. But she does. She does get it. Hooray for her. Hooray for Abigail Bailey. Our last document, Abigail and John Adams, starting to illustrate this shift from coverture, where women have zero rights, to Republican motherhood, where women have a little bit of rights. So Abigail Adams, very first thing right off the bat here, what does she say? She's writing this letter to John Adams. It's the middle of the Revolutionary War, remember. 1776, she's writing this. These are a founding family of the American colonies, soon to be America. She says, I wish you would write me a letter half as long as I write you and tell me, where's the fleet? What sort of defense Virginia is making? Are we situated as to make an able defense? Are the lords and common people vassals? Okay, so what is she saying? She's telling me about the war, man. Tell me about, how is the war going? Does she sound like a timid, meek, incapable, covered lady here? No, she is very capable. She is very interested, and she wants to know some information. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth paragraph down, that's the big one. She says, I long to hear that you have declared an independence. I long for America to be its own country. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I will suppose it will be necessary, every new country needs a new set of laws, I desire you would remember the ladies. This is her favorite line. I desire you to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. What is she doing here? Why is that paragraph so important? Right, she's using the language of the revolution itself. She talks about men being tyrants. George III's a tyrant. She talks about a rebellion. They're fomenting a rebellion right now. She talks about no representation to create their own laws. No taxation without representation, right? All of those big catchphrases for the males revolution are also here. And how does he react on the last page? John Adams writes back, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. What an ass. This guy, this is basically, you writing this big long text to your boyfriend and him just replying LOL. That's what this is. He just replies back LOL. He doesn't take them seriously at all. So we can see that if we're thinking about mastery during the early republic, women have a hefty goal to gain there because this idea of coverture is so entrenched. But as I hope we've discussed through some of our readings, the idea of Republican motherhood does slowly start to gain traction. And it's mostly because of the work of early founding mothers like Abigail Adams. The female counterparts to some of our founding fathers start arguing very convincingly that by using the language of the revolution itself, that women have a responsibility. This idea that women should be educated, should be capable, so that they can teach their sons, so that they can teach the next generation. If the entire country, we talked earlier, or you clicked through earlier about this, the image called America Guided by Wisdom. America Guided by Wisdom was our image for this module. And the whole point of that image was how all of these good things that the country wants or the country can get come down to individual Americans. If each individual American is not doing their job to the best of their ability, then the country will fail. It's a lot of pressure. But women are able to use that idea and say, if each individual citizen is responsible, personally responsible for the country, then mothers, as the first teachers of their sons, need to teach their sons how to be good citizens, how to be good little Republicans, little r, how to have good citizenship, how to be educated, how to be civically involved, how to be moral and upstanding and Christian and religious and generally good people all around. So this idea of Republican motherhood doesn't really give women any sort of legal rights, doesn't give them any sort of political rights, but now they have a social obligation. Now they have a social job. They're not just there. They have a purpose. And so that's very important if we're thinking about women's roles in the early republic. So thank you for discussing these documents with me, and I will see you next week.